Why play scrap? Well, don't! Thanks for watching. That's kind of the joke, but in general, if you have an emblem or a spot for it, scrap can be very strong. You have a variety of items, or a strong early game that you can play around scrap units. Additionally, you should understand that scrap is quite weak. It's very hard to stabilize on level 8, and it's a very tempo comp. You need to high roll, and a lot of times finding an early rumble will be a make or break on whether or not you top 4 with the scrap board. It's also very dependent on other 5 costs sometimes to give a lot of damage. However, scrap can be very rewarding and very strong if you have the spot for it, so be very cautious and careful when you play scrap. So who am I? This is my channel, Fenriba Gaming. I upload daily TFT content. They are guides like these. There are sometimes other sorts of guides. I'm trying to make as many guides as possible as I do daily content. 90% of you aren't subscribed. It would help me out a lot if you are a returning viewer, if you do subscribe, or if you're a new viewer, welcome aboard. And if you like TFT, this is a good channel for you. So let's go through scrap, the trait, and we'll discuss a lot of different boards and stuff like that in this guide. So scrap. Combat start, components held by scrap champions temporarily turn into full items. Scrap units gain shield for 20 seconds for each component held by your team, including those that make up a full item. So this also includes not only the scrap components, but includes regular items. So if you are playing with a lot of items, you get a lot of shield. The shield can scale with more items for that reason. Late game, scrap becomes very powerful because you generate so much shield. So based on the trait, it's an up to 9 trait, so you need 2 emblems in order to hit the prismatic. But basically with 2 scraps, 1 component turns into a completed item and you gain 25 shield on the scrap units for each component overall that all your units are holding. Additionally, then you have 4 scrap, which converts 3 components, 6 scrap, which converts all the components that you have left over, and the full items become lucky, which we'll talk about, and then it gives 50 shield, as well as 9, which generates radiant item. Now, when scrap is played, I'm kind of joking when I say you shouldn't play scrap. You should always play scrap. It's just you shouldn't play a board that's entirely composed of scrap units. Scrap is a very strong late game trait as well as early game trait. It's just the middle of the game where it feels a bit eh. And a lot of that's because of the current patch. It used to be one of the best comps, and then they kind of over-nerfed it a little bit. But you should understand that scrap is amazing to cap out boards. Converting a component into a completed item is massive because a completed item gives so much more stats as well as has lots of added effects. And in addition, if you're playing around scrap units, those scrap units also gain a large health shield later in the game when there are more items on your board. You don't have to play deep into the scrap trait to get a lot of shielding value because just with like a basic academy board a lot of the times that synergizes by giving a bunch of items, you can often make a really strong board with a lot of health shield. Now, there is one part that's a little bit confusing, which is 6. All fight items become lucky. So what does lucky items mean? I made this it's a little bit cumbersome, I agree, but this is just to serve as a general reference guide. But basically, each unit in their tooltip has like a suggested items list, and it's the same list that you get from lucky gloves. These lists is what dictates what items you can get off certain components. So if we're looking here at the units, I went through my game of playing scrap and I highlighted each of them to put next to the unit for you guys to use as a reference. So what this means is that when you get to 6 scrap and you make lucky items, for example, let's say you're playing powder and you put a tier on powder, that tier will turn into either a Shojin, an Archangels, or an Adaptive Helm. The idea is that based on the unit's role in the game and the items that you are suggested to make based on like the tooltip that's on the side of the screen whenever you highlight a unit, you will draw from this set of items in order to give them a quote-unquote lucky item. The idea is that the item is going to be slightly tailored to their role so it doesn't roll into a random item. With scrap, sometimes the random items are a little bit awkward because you have to still build a set of 3 items that make sense on every unit. What's good about this is that if you know what items that the unit can make, which are these particular ones in the tooltip. I don't know if you use a component outside these tooltips, what happens. That's like above my pay grade. But if you use an item, or if you use components from these tooltips, it will turn into one of these items. And if you can plan around that, there's some of these items that only use one of the components. You can actually guarantee the lucky item for certain units. So for example, with Ziggs, in his tooltip, there is not any other item that uses a glove, which means that if you give him a glove, it will always turn into a lucky, it will always lucky item in 6 scrap, turn into a jewel gauntlet. The same with belt for Gangplank, belt for Corki, tier for Ezreal, and tier for Rumble. So a lot of times if you build around these components, you should plan to hold these components and use this as like an opportunity to guarantee a particular item set on a unit. You see very often people put belt on Corki. That's why. It's not because belt on Corki is going to make Corki tanky and there's some like secret sauce there. It's that if you're playing around vertical scrap and you hit 6 scrap and you're playing you have a lucky item on Corki, then the belt will always roll into a guard breaker, so it's very easy to play around that, because then you can build your other Corki items to play into the idea that you're going to have a guard breaker on him eventually. The same thing with Echo and Rumble with the Hand of Justice that will always come from a tier. So, when to play scrap? When you should usually not really angle yourself towards scrap unless you have to play scrap. A lot of times, like early item slams or lots of like good items that can fit to a late game board are nice. A mixture of AD and AP is really nice, and typically I like to play scrap if I have more glove items, because there's a lot of glove synergies that come from the lucky items. So stuff like Jewel Gauntlet Hodge, IE. Think about itemizing towards Ezreal and itemizing towards Corki and itemizing towards Rumble at one point. However, I wouldn't really touch scrap unless you have a scrap emblem, which even then isn't that great. If you have some sort of augment that you have to take, that you feel like it's your best opportunity for like your early games, or something like top of the scrap heap, or if you hit it with something like tower defense. Scrap is very strong. It's just when you play 6 scrap, the board is really hard to stabilize, and that's why I always say be very careful when you're playing around scrap. What I would always recommend is that even if you have a scrap opener, you should always look for a different angle that makes the most out of the units that you're playing, instead of trying to play around scrap in particular. Of course, if you high roll or if you hit all the units that you need to hit, you can by all means play vertical scrap, and you can even go first. This comp is capable of going first. I'm not saying that it isn't. It's just that it feels very high roll when it does. Now, I'll try and describe what I mean by this. So for example, if you take 2 scrap, 2 scrap is very good at capping out boards. It has a very high average placement, not because of scrap in particular, it's just that it's a component of many top boards. Many of the best boards in TFT utilize the idea that 2 scrap gives you a lot of shielding late game for those particular units. Rumble is a great unit. He's Sentinel and gets a bunch of shield and does a bunch of damage, and it's very easy to just fit it in because it's a 2 trait. So there's a lot of boards that play around 2 scrap, and that's typically where you end up a lot of the time. So the scrap trait is strong, it's just something that requires you to get to late game, and usually that's by the means of other units. If you look at 4 scrap, you'll notice that 4 scrap is trash. 6 scrap is very mid. It's typically more skewed towards you doing quite poorly because it's not that strong and it's very high roll, so your spot has to be good. You can still top 4 pretty easily. It's not that bad of an average, it's just that it's kind of mid. If you have the opportunity to play something else, you should maybe play something else, unless you have a really good scrap spot, like you have an augment or an emblem, then you should maybe consider scrap. And then obviously 9 scrap is the prismatic, so you're going to go first. It's going to have a very high chance of going first. But even then, 9 scrap out of most of the 2 emblem traits is actually pretty mid as well. It doesn't have the highest win percentage as some of the other ones that require 2 emblems, and this is 2 uncraftable emblems, by the way. So overall, the trait in every regard, besides like just splashing it in, is not very strong, and a lot of it is just because of the units and their synergies. It's hard to build a cohesive board around them. So let's talk about the scrap units themselves. You have lots of early game scrap units that are great to play tempo with. Something like Trundle and Powder. Powder isn't that great because she takes a really long time to cast, but there's ways to remedy this, which we'll talk about after. But you have good opportunity, like if you have a Trundle and a Ziggs, for example, to have early game tempo by taking a component and turning it into an extra item. And items can really sway fights in early game, and they can also sway fights sometimes in late game. You have Gangplank, who's a form swapper. Gangplank is a very strong unit, and you can play deep into the form swapper trade, and you often have success if you can hit a Gangplank 3. It is a little bit awkward because other form swappers are high cost. Echo is great in Ambusher, but out of all the 4 costs, he feels the most like mid. It's really hard because he's like not quite amazing as a frontline unit, but he does really high damage with Ambusher. But then all the other Ambusher units are low cost units, so typically you're re-rolling and you're not itemizing towards Echo in the first place. It's a little bit awkward. Corki's great this patch right now. But Corki, usually you play with other boards, which we'll talk about a little bit after. And then Rumble, this is the Giga Tyrant. Rumble is just the best, one of the best units in the game. Absolutely broken, absolutely amazing. If you see a Rumble, you should almost always find an excuse to play the Rumble on your board, and you'll probably do better for doing that. Rumble is incredible, and finding Rumble early is a major win con for Scrap. These scrap units, the thing that ties these together is just Rumble being a Giga unit, and playing deep into traits that Rumble has is going to give Rumble both survivability as well as the ability to do damage, which we'll talk about in a second. Now, when you're playing around a scrap board, typically you want to get to 6 scrap if you're dedicated towards the scrap trait. If you're trying to play vertical scrap, that's what the point of this video is, by the way. Whenever I talk about this video, whenever I say how to play scrap, I don't mean like, hey, these are all the boards where you fit into scrap. It's like, no, what we're talking about is playing scrap deep into the vertical trait. So we're trying to hit 6 scrap, because the other thing is 9 scrap beyond that, and that needs 2 emblems. So that's like a high roll thing that you don't have to worry about. But if you're playing around 6 scrap, typically what you want to do is you want to find a Rumble as early as possible. Why do you want to find Rumble as early as possible? Because Rumble has a trait called Junker King. And with Rumble, basically you get upgrades every single couple rounds. I think it's every 3 rounds or so. You can buy for 5 gold an upgrade, or you can skip to get spare parts where you get AP and a little bit of health. But the idea is, the earlier that you have a Rumble, the more of these upgrades you can get. And the more of these upgrades you can get, the more of a monster this Rumble is late game. Even in a non-scrap situations, an early Rumble that you get multiple of these upgrades with will actually turn into an insane unit, because you're investing a lot of gold into the Rumble in the first place. You buy him as a 5 cost, then you have to spend 5 gold on each upgrade every couple turns. So it should be good, right? There's nothing wrong with it being good. It's just that it's very skewed towards hitting the Rumble early. Now, in terms of all of the ones that you want to take, there's one that's like, some of these are like you hit like really hard, like Finishing Touch. You'll probably never see that in a game. Junkyard Titan, I think, is if you have 3-star Rumble, so don't worry about Junkyard Titan. But Flamethrower, Petrice Rock, I think it's Petrice Rock, Rod, sorry. Repairing Microbot, Self-Destruction Button, Spare Parts Tank Buster. If we're talking about which ones the best ones are, Self-Destruct Button is very strong, especially if you have a lot of Sentinel. He just deletes the whole board. And then something like Tank Buster as well as Petrice Rod are very strong. Flamethrower is also really good. But typically with all of these builds, it leads us back to like our Rumble, because if we're thinking about playing scrap and we're trying to play around this Rumble, you really want to have a lot of gold to roll on 8, or you want to be able to fast 9 to find a Rumble early. When you're playing around Rumble, you want to build them with crit items. That's what I find the most success with. When you have crit items, the Flamethrower crits, the rockets that shoot the backline crit, the explosion crits, like if all of his moves do massive amounts of damage, and if you can get them to guaranteed crit, he does an insane amount of damage. So here I have like Spark, just because it's a frontline item, but typically you want to make sure that you have Jewel Gauntlet and Hodge. Now, Hand of Justice, it works as an Omnivamp item, and it gives him some good sustained frontline. And Jewel Gauntlet is a really good pairing because it makes his abilities crit, and it's another glove component. We're using 2 items that both give him glove items, and these 2 glove items will then stack the crit chance to make it more guaranteed that he gets the crit off when he casts his different abilities that you get from his upgrades. The one that you usually don't want to go for is Repairing Microbots. That one feels really underpowered. It doesn't actually help him that much. So you always want to go for the damage ones more so, and then you can kind of decide based on the boards. Like if you're having trouble chewing through a front line, Tank Buster a little bit better. If you think that like they have a really strong front line and you want to kill the back line by cheesing it, then you can take the one that shoots the back line units, etc. Like you have different options like that. But typically, much of the success of playing 6 scrap is going to come from finding an early Rumble. If you don't find the early Rumble, it's 8th Rumble. The Kayla's the only one that really works with that, okay? Rumble or Fumble, somebody said in my chat, but like I don't even like that one because it makes me feel bad that like you're not fumbling if you don't find a Rumble, you know what I mean? But like you really need Rumble to make the 6 scrap work. But typically you want this. If you think about Hand of Justice as well, Hand of Justice, remember on our slideshow, I showed you these items. You always guaranteed make a Hand of Justice if you give Rumble a tier and your 6 scrap, which is your lucky components. So basically with Rumble, your itemization is Jewel Gauntlet, and then you can just find like 1 itemization. This isn't like necessarily the best thing ever. This is the thing that I like. But you can just make a Jewel Gauntlet and a tier, and it will guaranteed roll into Jewel Gauntlet Hodge or Hand of Justice, which is great. Echo, a similar way. I like to have crit because I just play into the ambusher trait. And then you can play around Corki. Corki usually want crit items, and then you can put a belt on Corki. Belt will always turn into guard breaker, so you can go IE Last Whisper, get some items that give attack speed and give AD and give crit chance, and then get the guard breaker, which gives him the damage amp as well as another crit glove item to guarantee the crits. Gangplank likes to cast as well as do crit damage, so you can build him any array of crit and damage items. And then you have Powder for synergy because of Ambusher. The benefit of playing Scrap, this is one of the best things about Scrap, is that the board is very flexible based on what you hit. You have a Trundle, which is a bruiser, and you have a Rumble, which is a Sentinel. So you can easily fit in an Elise, which gives you Form Swapper to help your damage on your Gangplank. You can fit in an Alawi, which gives you Sentinel. And additionally, because you have the Echo and you're playing around Ambusher, you can cap very high around playing Jinx. If you're a primary carry Echo, like you don't hit a Rumble early, the same items that you would put on Rumble, you can put on Echo because he's a frontline AP unit, the same way Rumble is a frontline AP unit. So in your early game, you can play around this Echo, and you can also play around an extra Jinx, which gives you a maximum, a higher Ambusher, which gives him more damage. Now, the problem with this board is that it's not very stable on level 8. I've had games where I have hit Echo 2-star, Elise 2-star, Alawi 2-star, Corki 2-star, and I'm still losing to other boards that have more stability, like a Heimer Sentinels and something else, right? It is very hard to be stable with this board because you're relying a lot on the scrap shielding. If it's not a high item game, like it really depends on how many items you have, right? If it's a game where you have an infinite, really large amount of items and you're tempoing the lobby very aggressively, then your level 8 will be great. And if you can make it to level 9 fast and you can find an upgraded Rumble 2, then you're in a game-winning spot. So out of nowhere, this comp could be one of the strongest comps in the game very easily. However, the problem is if you're stuck on level 8 and you don't have upgrades, Corki is very contested, it's hard to find sometimes. Elise is very contested, she's hard to find sometimes. Alawi is also hard to find sometimes. It's very difficult to stabilize and be very strong at a low level, and that's what the problem is. So you have to play this comp from ahead so you have enough HP to make it to level 9. If you don't have enough HP to play around your stage 4 and make it to level 9, a lot of times you can bleed out and end up bot 4. This comp can look like the strongest comp in the game, and then you just end up 5th. That's happened so many times. It happens to so many people. I've watched it happen on streams 100,000 times. I've seen people lose with 9 scrap and go 8th as well because they just don't have the upgrades to Rumble and Echo, and then the Radiant items don't even matter. They just lose in a high roll lobby. All sorts of bad things can happen with this comp. However, it is a very fun comp. So if you have the opportunity to play it, you have a lot of flexibility in what you play. Here I'm playing Tristana for Emissary as well as playing around this Corki. But you have a lot of flexibility. Like as I showed you, you can play around Elise, Alawi, like any front line you can kind of fit in. Echo is fun because nobody buys Echo, so you can pretty easily hit the Echo too. So you have a lot of opportunity. Now, positioning is something I want to mention with the scrap. So one thing we'll highlight right now before we show any other boards is also the scrap shield. So sometimes you will see people do this and this. Does that make sense to you? Yes or no? Now it might not make sense, but you often see this happen. Why am I putting Corki and Powder in the front line? This is a common thing to do with scrap at all levels of scrap. 6 scrap, 4 scrap, even 2 scrap. Sometimes people will put Corki in the front line. Now, why do you put Corki in the front line? You get this shield. Depending on how big your scrap shield is, this shield only lasts for 20 seconds. So if a fight is very long, you want it, the shield basically disappears by the end of the fight. What you do here is you put Corki in the front line. When a unit gets hit by an enemy attack, they generate mana. That's part of the tools of mana, right? Like you can generate mana from attacking, you can generate mana from items like a Shojin or a blue buff or an adaptive helm, but you can also generate mana by being hit. A lot of the time, because the Corki has this health shield that only lasts for the first portion of the fight, if you put Corki in the front line, he will absorb the damage in the health shield. He will not take actual damage. He will just take damage in the form of the health shield, especially if you're 6 scrap. Then, Corki's ability, he locks onto targets and he strafes to a nearby position. If you put him in the front line, he will just strafe out of the front line once he does his first cast. So he becomes safe after. By putting him in the front line, you are then generating mana, like by getting hit a little bit, And by getting that extra mana, you can cast a little bit earlier. By casting earlier, you reach your damage threshold a little bit sooner. It's just more optimal. That's the idea. It's the same with Powder, right? Powder takes a really long time to cast. She has a really high mana cost, 120. A lot of fights, by the time Powder casts, the fight is over. Instead, you can put Powder in the front line. If you put Powder in the front line, she takes a little bit of damage as long as you don't put her, if you put her somewhere in the middle, usually she's pretty safe, right? Because the enemy carries will target the edges often earlier, right? But if you put her in a spot in the front line, she can get her cast off a lot earlier by absorbing hits, and getting those hits generates mana, and then she gets to a point where she actually gets her cast off. That's the idea. Now, when you're playing 6 scrap as well, you should always make sure that everybody is holding a component. It doesn't matter what the component is. Try and prioritize good components on your carries to guarantee proper item sets. Like Belt on Corki is really good. Tier on both Echo and Rumble is very good. And then a lot of different items work really nicely on Gangplank. Like a sword could be many different good items, as well as like glove or stuff like that. You know, putting these items generates more scrap shield because it will count as extra components, because those one component will turn into 2 components. So if you have 6 scrap, you basically get 6 extra copies of shield, so you get an extra 300 shield on everybody, because 6 components will convert into complete items. So you should always guarantee that everybody's holding at least one component to make sure that you get maximum scrap value. Now, some other renditions of boards. This is a 6 scraps force form swapper variation. I've seen this one be really successful, but this is a very high roll comp, because not only are you playing around scrap that you hit 6 scrap, you also have to hit Gangplank 3, often you have to hit Swain 3, and you have to hit Jace, and then you have to be like a high level as well. It's a little bit more high roll. There's other variations of this board where you play 4 form swapper that cap out equally as high. But this one is something that if you hit like Gangplank 3-star and you have a Rumble early, you can maybe play towards 6 scrap. I've seen it done before, but I wouldn't recommend this all the time. This is like a sometimes food. Additionally, I've seen people play around 4 Artillerist with 6 scrap. Like I said before, there are other variations of this comp, like Urgot reroll with Tristana reroll, Artillerist with Emissary with Corki. We did videos on that are very strong. There's many other options that you can play if you're trying to play Corki main carry, but like I said, if you hit an early Rumble and maybe you're in a spot where you think you can play a comp like this is also another variation or another option that you can play. But typically when you see scrap, what you're often going to do is you're going to play around 2 scrap units, usually Rumble and something else, and then you play it with another board. I made an Academy video recently where I talked about Rumble with Corki or Echo and playing Academy with Jason Heimer. These are often boards that you play late game. There's other boards, for example, where you can play, you can play Rumble, Echo, where's Echo? Echo and Jinx, right? These are boards where you just play 2 scrap. Here, I'll put it at the bottom corner here, where you're playing around Rebels, right? The highest cap of playing 7 Rebel is you play Jinx, and then you play Rumble and Echo. That gives you the Sentinel for the synergy with Alawi, right? And you play Echo because Echo is really strong in those setups, right? If you look at the best, like, you know, comps with Echo, for example, right? Let's go like units. Let's go Echo. Where's Echo? Echo, 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 Echo. Right? Like Echo's best items all the time is like a Rebel emblem for that reason. Because you just fit him in on the Rebel board, right? Like if you look at his best items, it's always Rebel or Enforcer. Right? It's very rarely like another item set because you very rarely play Echo outside of those boards. He doesn't do that much in scrap. He works as a decently good damage dealer in frontline unit, but it's a little bit awkward. But these are some boards. Also, Echo, sometimes you can play like those ones like Echo with like Heimerdinger and you can play Geniuses. But a lot of times when you're playing Echo, it's better just to play Vertical Ambusher and not to play scrap. But anyways, I digress. That's a little bit of late game board so you can get like the juices flowing. You can have some ideas. Early game scrap is very strong. You can often play around it. You just don't have to commit to it. A lot of times you'll start the game off with something like this, where you'll have a couple of components and you'll have a Ziggs and a Trundle. Playing around scrap early game is very strong. You get the health shield and you get a completed item, which puts you like up an entire resource on your opponent, right? If you have an extra item, that's the equivalent of being up a silver augment, right? A silver augment is gain a random completed item. That's a silver augment. So scrap in itself, the way you can look at it is you get a free silver augment. Now, obviously most traits are like that, but if you can play around it, it's very strong. It's very strong early. If you have a Ziggs 2 and you just put a scrap value in, it's very powerful. I would definitely recommend playing around scrap early. Better yet, if you have 4 scrap, for example, let's say you have a scrap emblem, you could tempo very hard, right? A lot of the problems of this comp is, like I said before, you need to find Rumble, you need to hit level 9 in order to hit these 5 costs, and you need to survive until late game in order to actually realize the full potential of the comp. Right? Late game, when there's so many items on the board, you get so much more health shield. So in order to survive a really long game until late in the game, you need to start the game off with a lot of HP. You need to be very strong in your early game so that you have enough HP to live a very long and fruitful game that you can get a bunch of items on your board. A lot of that helps with early game tempo. A scrap emblem early often is very strong. You get up multiple items, right? 3 components. If you have 3 components, you get 3 whole items up on the lobby, right? 3 whole items up on the lobby. That is very strong. I cannot stress it enough. Like early 4 scrap or even an early 6 scrap, a lot of times you'll see people and they completely win out from that spot because they can go instantly to level 9. They win every single round and you're very strong. When I say scrap is weak, it's not to say that it's weak in these spots. It's not weak late game if you have a rumble. It's weak in that middle part where you're level 8, and if you don't have like 100 HP and you're level 8 with like, you know, rolling to 0 trying to find an upgrade and you have Echo 1, Corky 1, it's like you could just go 8th instantly. You have no level of stability because the board just falls apart. You don't have enough shielding value because you don't have enough items yet. And you don't have like good damage. You don't have anything that really functions as a proper board. Obviously, scrap might get buffed in the future. So if you watch this video and you see some of these are things to keep in mind. Right now, you require to have a good spot for it. Maybe they buff scrap next patch. And then all of a sudden, everything's broken. Who knows? I don't. We'll see where it ends up. But anyways, that's mostly the guide for now. What are your conditions for success? Just to reiterate so that everybody leaves the video with like a little bit of a notepad filled with notes. You want a strong early game, right? Tempoing is very good with scrap. If you're weak early, scrap isn't going to save you later unless you high roll into a rumble. So you want to have the HP lead in order to survive the game long enough to get the full value of your scrap shields late game. You also want to be in a position where you kind of have to play scrap. Even if you find like an early Corky and you have a 6 scrap board, a lot of times it's better to just take that Corky and play towards Artillerist or play towards Academy or play towards some other board that is a little bit stronger. Unless you have like a scrap emblem, I personally wouldn't angle myself towards scrap. It is what it is, but that's the way TFT is. Sometimes there's comps that are significantly weaker than others, and those are the comps that get buffed in the future. We're still early in the set. We're not even halfway through the set. I'm sure scrap will be broken at least one patch in the future. So obviously, the only reason I'm making this video, by the way, I would have waited until scrap got a bit better. I might make another video when scrap becomes better, but somebody requested it in the comments. If you want to see me talk about a particular trait, you can request in the comments. I'll give my opinion, I'll talk through it, and I'll go through everything. So that's what I'm doing here. I even played scrap today, for those that don't know. Like, I'm not a liar when I do this. It comes from me having played the trait multiple times. I played scrap at least like 5 times within the last patch, which isn't that many, mind you, but it's a pretty bad trait, and I've been going bot 4 with it every single time. You also have to have lots of scrap units, right? If you can hit a GP3, Gangplank 3 is a great way to make a lot of damage, and the 4 Form Swapper board, anytime you have 4 Form Swapper, it doesn't matter what you play around them, the 4 Form Swappers together are extremely strong. So Swain 3, Gangplank 3 with the Jason Elise is broken. It is very strong. The problem is, 2 Form Swapper is okay, but sometimes you just die and you just go 8th. So Gangplank 3, Swain 3, if you find an early Jace and you're playing around scrap, like if you high roll a Jace and a Rumble, you could play towards this board, and it is quite strong. I'm not saying it isn't, but obviously you want 2 different things. If you're rolling for Gangplank, then you're not rolling for 5 costs, and if you don't hit the 5 cost, then you don't hit Gangplank. It becomes too much to do. That's why it has to be very high roll, whenever I say that it's high roll. Also, you want to have good econ to make it to level 9. Early Rumble is critical because you want those upgrades, right? Let's go back. You want these upgrades as early as possible. If you hit a rumble late in the game, it's not going to save you. Hitting a rumble early is critical when you're playing around vertical scrap, because rumble a lot of times is going to be your main carry and your main damage dealer. So you want to make sure that you have as many of the upgrades on the rumble as possible. And additionally, you do have a win con with 9 scrap. If you hit something like tower defense, or if you hit branching out and you get scrap, a lot of times you can very easily hit 9 scrap. It's not like a 10 trait. So even with a wandering trainer, if you're playing Mbessa encounter and you get a scrap emblem, you can be 9 scrap on level 8. So there's a really high chance that you can win out from a scrap position if you play towards it and you get the win con. But thank you. Make sure to like and subscribe if you like my content. Thank you for watching. Hopefully it wasn't too bad. I know that I spent like 30 minutes basically shitting on this scrap trait. It is what it is. It isn't that strong right now. It might be stronger a bit later. There are great spots. Like I said, you could go first playing scrap. I'm not just saying that. I truly believe it. I've seen it happen. It's just that you have to be in a good spot. So if you even have the slightest shiver that you might be in a weak spot right now, then you shouldn't play it, in my opinion. But by all means, experiment, have fun, try it out. I'm sure you'll all have success playing scrap. Just remember some of the tips and tricks I mentioned here, and that will help you out, even if you are the scrap whisperer and I'm not the scrap whisperer. By all means, have fun, have a great day, and see ya. Bye bye.